little bit interesting to never really have a good idea what you're going to preach on Sunday evening until Sunday morning is over, right? So I've chosen to give myself the latitude that if in our auditorium class there's something that was kind of left on the table that we need to discuss further, I'll do that. And I certainly have a backup plan of other lessons that we can do on Sunday nights. But I didn't know until we got finished this morning which way I'd do. And so I want to continue the kind of interrupted study we've done for some time that we based on Acts chapter 1, verse 1, essentially, where Luke is telling Theophilus that in his former treatise, he wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach. And the implication of that is that Jesus in this volume is going to continue, in the book of Acts, is going to continue to do and to teach. So he began to do and to teach in Luke the Gospel and continued to do and to teach in the book of Acts. And so how did he do that? He certainly did it through the apostles and then ultimately through the church. And so we're kind of basing it. Did Jesus at some point retire? That's the idea. As we watch Him in His ministry in the Gospels, we see Him come, we see Him interact with people. But is He in a retirement home in heaven, or is Jesus active? And so the assertion that we have, we've asserted the idea that Jesus continues to do and to teach through His body, the church. And we could go to other places, and I won't rehash all that we did at the beginning of this study. But I want to talk about the idea tonight, and we'll look at one primary passage, that Jesus continues to touch lepers and sinners through His body, the church. And so I want us to go directly, if you would, to Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, a passage that we know pretty well. It's a pretty short passage. It's a pretty short group of people in here. Not that y'all are all short, but we're missing a lot of folks, and so I won't tell the story again about the preacher who preached a whole big old long sermon when he had one old guy come in the blizzard to come to church, right? So y'all know that, right? How'd I do? So, preacher, you did pretty good, but in my business, if only one cow comes up, we don't unload the whole truck, right? So I'm not going to unload the whole truck on you. But I want us to look at Luke 5, verse 12 and following. While he was in one of those cities, he being Jesus, there came a man full of leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his feet and begged Him, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out His hand and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. And he charged him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as Moses commanded for a proof to them. But now even more, the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities. I don't know how far I'm going to go with this. Let me start a little bit. I've got a whole lot of information here, and I'm going to filter as we go, all right? I won't unload the whole truck. But when we hear leprosy, we've all seen pictures probably, if you've looked in the old, y'all remember encyclopedias? We used to look stuff up in encyclopedias, right? Big giant volumes of books and look at pictures, and you'd see this nasty looking, people missing fingers, nasty, crusty looking skin disease. It was terrible. But we'll find out, and we'll look here in a moment, that this word leprosy covered a variety of mostly skin diseases, but of different kinds of diseases. Somebody's even included lupus in the diseases that might be covered under this heading of leprosy. And maybe our lupus word kind of comes from that. I don't know. They sound a little bit alike, right? If we want the background, and we could go back and look at all of it, but if you turn to Leviticus chapters 13 and 14, we'll see all the prescriptions about the diagnosis of these diseases and also how they're to be declared, and we'll look at some of that, but not quite yet. And so I want us to look at this idea. Jesus touched the lepers and the sinners. The main theme we want to look at is that Jesus touched this guy. Did He need to do that? He had some type of disease, something that fell under this term leprosy. And very likely it could have been an infectious disease. Now, I'm trying to decide how far I want to go and where I want to come back to. Let's just start by going back to Luke 14 and beginning in verse 2. I want to give us some background, okay? This is going to be a little longer than I want it to be, but we won't do all of it. But Leviticus chapter 14, beginning in verse 2, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then if the case of the leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds and cedar wood, scarlet yarn and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over fresh water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird go in an open field. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, and shave off all of his hair, and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent for 7 days. And on the 7th day he shall shave off all of his hair from his head, his beard and his eyebrows, and he shall shave off all his hair. And then he shall wash his clothes, and bathe his body in water, and shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, and 1 ewe lamb, a year old, without blemish, and a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, and 1 log of oil. And the priest who cleanses him shall set the man to be cleansed, and these things before the Lord at the tent of meeting. And the Lord shall take the priest shall take 1 of the male lambs and offer it for a guilt offering, along with the log of oil. Wave them as a wave offering before the Lord, and he shall kill the lamb in the place where they kill the sin offering and the burnt offering in the place of the sanctuary. For the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of the right hand, and on the big toe of the right foot. Then the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it into the palm of his left hand, and dip with his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand, and sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. And some of the oil that remains in his hand the priest shall put on the lobe of his right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. And the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand shall be put on his head of him who is cleansed. And the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. And the priest shall offer the sin offering to make atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanness. And afterward he shall kill the burnt offering. And the priest shall offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be clean. So if he's poor, we're going to go through the whole thing again and talk about different animals in some instances, right? Was that a little busy? There's a lot. There's a lot there. It would be good to go back through that passage and just see the allusions, just see the types for baptism, the types for the Azazel, the Paschal Lamb. There's so many types there and typology of the realities that we have in Christ, but that's not what we're looking at, is it? We're not going to take the time to talk about the cleansing ceremony that someone had to go through if they touched someone who was a leper. But trust me, it was nearly as involved as this ceremony. If I were a leper, I walked around, and as somebody was approaching, I began to yell out that I'm a leper, so that someone wouldn't become ceremonially unclean and have to go through all the cleansing. It was expected that if you were leprous, you would make that known so that someone could avoid you. I don't know how many years did it say. I don't recall it saying how many years this man had been a leper. How long he had been outside the camp. How long he had been away from his family. I could see where family even would come and stand at some distance, even if they brought him food and were taking care of him. Otherwise, it was quite the hassle to go through the cleansing ceremonies and to go through if I'm ceremonially unclean, I can't go to the markets, I can't go to the temple, I can't go through all the normal routines. I've got to pull myself out of that. And so they avoided people. But as we look at our story, Jesus encounters a man who was covered with leprosy. I don't think this guy had to yell much, but he does speak. When the leper saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground. There's some humility. He begged him, more humility. Lord, I wish I could spend a little time emphasizing this word Lord here. In the Greek, kurios could mean sir, but in this way, he's understanding him as someone. And if you are willing, you can make me clean. What a statement of faith. What a statement of faith. The question, Lord, I know you're Lord. The question, Lord, is not can you make me clean, is do you have a will to make me clean? I like the way the ESV reads. It reads a little difficult in a sense of it's not the expected phrase. And as you first read it, you think it's saying something else. But as you look at it, it's about as good as you can do. He says, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. Then Jesus says, I will be clean. It's not like I'm going to heal you. It's not I will heal you. It's I will. I have a will. I do will to heal you is the idea. I like the way that says I will because in the Greek it's a single word. Our language doesn't work the same. So I will is about as close as you could do it. What's interesting to me, he said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And when Jesus said, I will, he said it in the Greek in the Greek present tense, which indicates ongoing action. So he's speaking of himself, Lord, if you're willing, you can heal me. And Jesus said, I am willing. I stand willing. I am willing, as it were. I also think it's interesting as he continues on, I'm willing, or I will. And then he says, be clean in this one, or in the NIV it said, what was it? I am willing, he said, be clean. This word be clean, another one word, if I recall correctly, is an aorist passive imperative. I love the aorist passive imperative, don't you? Let's talk about it. It's a little bit Greeky, a little bit part of speechy, but he said, be clean. Aorist means punctiliar action. He's speaking of a point in time. I want you to be clean. The man he's speaking to is going to be passive in that action. And yet, it is in the voice of a command. Have you ever been told to do something where you're passive in the action, but it's a command of God? Try this one. Repent and let each one of you be baptized. Works salvation? Works healing in this passage? Well, Jesus says, I am willing, be healed. Much like he says, be baptized for us. Another connection, I think, as we look at those things. Well, I got much I want to say, but I'm going to put a bow on this thing. Is that all right? I was thinking about this passage. I was thinking about others. Our title is Jesus Continues to Touch Lepers and Sinners Through His Body, the Church. I thought about Mark chapter 2 in verse 15. As he reclined at the table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed Him. Many who? Many in general? There were many tax collectors and sinners reclining with Jesus, for there were many that followed Him. The language, I don't know that I can prove it to you, but the language most naturally reads, there were many tax collectors and sinners reclining with Jesus, for many of them followed Him. Many of the tax collectors and sinners. I want to ask us for a moment, how many tax collectors, sinners, lepers, AIDS victims, you fill it in, are hanging out with us? But they were hanging out with Jesus. And if the whole basis of this series of lessons holds true, that the things that Jesus was doing in His ministry, He continues to do through His body, the church. Do we kind of think that that tenet is solid? I do. You don't have to commit yourself to it. I wrote to you, Theophilus, in my former treatise about all that Jesus began to do and to teach. And so, as we read through, did anyone get healed? Were there any people that the apostles were touching that were pretty tough people? Oh, I think so. There's demon-possessed people. There's people with all kinds of illnesses. There's a whole lot of things. We're going to go and preach to people who believe that Paul and Silas were gods because Paul shaked a snake off and they tried to worship him as Mercury, and I don't know. Go back and read Acts and all this. Go to Mars Hill. Go to Athens. Go to these places. Go to Corinth. Oh, there's you a place, right? If we go to the book of 1 Corinthians, right? Paul takes the gospel to Corinth. And in the book of 1 Corinthians, talks about adulterers and murderers and homosexual offenders, all kinds of people. And such were some of you. But you were washed, you were cleansed, you were justified. How did they get in? How did the murderers and the adulterers and the homosexual offenders and the effeminate and all these people that Paul lists in 1 Corinthians 6 who had been washed and cleansed and justified, how did they get in the church? How did they hear the gospel? Well, I think in a word, the church, the apostles were willing to get their hands dirty and spend a little time with some people who certainly were not perfect. We read the burnt offering and the sin offering that had to be give up. Typically the burnt offering is completely burnt up. It's to make atonement. There's an atonement figure in all these things. It's the olah, that which ascends. The sin offering was eaten with the priest before the Lord. A big significance, though there was an atonement area in that. There was a fat portion that's burned up before the Lord, and atonements in that. But a lot of this you sat and ate with the priest. You gathered your family, and it had to do with the restoration of fellowship. This man, after Jesus healed him, after he presented himself to the priest, after he went through this week plus of actions, was reconnected to God. He was reconnected to family. He was reconnected to society. He could once again go into town. He could once again hug his grandchildren if he had some. He could once again shake his neighbor's hand. He could once again go to the market and do commerce. He was restored to where he belongs. And there's a world of people out there that are struggling with a lot of things that are uncomfortable to us. But there's only one hope for them to fully be restored to who God wanted them to be in the first place. To be reconnected to God. To be connected to God's family and to God's society. And that's that we go out and meet them where they are. In this story, Jesus would have become ceremonially unclean by touching him. He would have risked infection. He certainly would have incurred criticism by others for touching this man. Yet Jesus touched him. Does Jesus touch sick and hurting people today? Here's what I know, present tense. He is willing. The question is, are we? Jesus will continue to touch lepers and sinners through His body of the church if we understand that Jesus intends for us to do all that He began to do and to teach. I don't know what your need may be this evening, how we might best serve you. Sometimes I think we get blinded by time. Maybe insulated by affinity. Can I say it that way? I'll tell you what I mean is, I like you people. I like hanging out with you. But every minute I spend hanging out with you is a minute I'm not hanging out with some of them. One little side note. There was some reason that those people wanted to come hang out with Jesus. They were comfortable sitting down and eating a meal with Him. Where are the tax collectors, the sinners, and the lepers that are hanging around us? He is willing. Are we? If we can pray with you, if we can study with you, encourage you in some way, we want to do it. If you're not in Christ, and as I look around this room, I don't see many folks that fall outside that description. But if we can help you in any way, won't you come while we stand and sing this song?